So the title that I was given today to talk about was the challenges of the church in France, challenges of the French church in the 17th century. I have, and you have the text in your desk, but also when you have to spend a just a one period and you don't have the history before, sometimes you miss the whole story. I'll try to give you from a book that I've written that's not published yet, that I wrote to give classes to our seminarians in the special year of spirituality. I give it twice. We're ready, we go closely, we'll be publishing it. You have the text of that in the back on page, it starts on page 29, but I will be using it on the page, mostly starting on page 30. When the history, when you want to, I write in there that knowing our history, knowing our past, helps us understand the present better. Knowing where we came from, our country, our family, even our genetic makeup helps us understand ourselves. And now it's so fabulous. Nowadays we can map where we are from. You can even send a sample of your DNA to the Genome Project, and they'll tell you the mapping up of where your genes came from. And it's fabulous that they show and there's a nice, you can check that out with the National Geographic in the Genome Program. They show that we all come from North Africa, and how people, and they can follow the genes where people split up. Well, those who went to Europe, those who went there. All of us, different race, different right. We all come from the same, all the Homo sapiens come from the same origin. And so that is it. But when we try to look at the history of Europe here, that we are partly influenced, we go back, and I know I've written something there, you don't see it, but I'll point it out to you. You have it all in the book, in the sense, but I try to give it in a graphic way, is the beginning of the church was during the Roman Empire. You have the picture there, it's not in color like mine, but it shows you that the Roman Empire that lasted about 1,000 years in Rome. It ended in 476, the last emperor. That was the situation when Christ was born. And it was what permitted the church to spread all around the Mediterranean Sea, which the Roman call Mare Nostra. We mean our sea, and you can see why. You just look at a map, they own everything around. And that gives the chance to the church to spread. St. Paul in particular used the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, the fact that you could travel all over to really set in centers. He went to places, the Juggernaut, I would call it, places that are important. He went to Antioch of Syria. He went to Ephesus. It was a great port, seaport, all in what is now Turkey. When you go to Syria, it was the capital of the province. Everybody went there. He went to Corinth. It was in Greece, between where the passage of the seas, there were so many sailors. If he converted some, they went all through the empire. He went to Philippi and over there in the north, and all those areas which were on the route to Constantinople. It was the Roman road. So he really chose, then went to Rome, the center of the Roman universe at the time. And that helped spread the word throughout the empire. And you have that spreading in there. But when Rome fell in 476, Byzantium had been founded by Constantine, who very humbly named the city after himself. So he called it Constantinopolis, Constantinople. And that city continued to last after Rome fell. It lasted for another 600 years after. It lasted a total of 1,000 about. And it fell to the the Ottoman Empire in 1060. And that's the correspondence I put here when William the Conqueror, 6 years later, conquered England. So it gives you in your mind those great figures. But I want to give that to situate. So what happened in Europe at the fall of the Roman Empire? Well, one of the things that it did is to give the church remain the only structure in place. That was when there were little countries that fed up the chieftain that settled, and gradually you had little kingdoms that settled. But the real uniting power was the church. And then when the the barbarians came, the invasions of the barbarian, the Visigoth, and all those things that you've heard, they gradually got converted. And they, in turn, influence the church, the influence in the liturgy. One of the important group, the one only uniting group after the fall of the empire, came about in 800, around the century 800, with Charlemagne. Charlemagne was part of a tribe of the Germanic tribes called the Franks. And the Franks had gradually been in invading France, what they gave the name to France, and also French. But they were of German origin. Now, I'll come back to that because it's important for our history. Is that Charlemagne united what you see on page 31, you have the view of what his empire became. It didn't cover all of an empire, but it covered a good part of Europe, what is Germany and a lot of the countries of Europe here. He didn't conquer Italy. He was the master he could control. And so he's the one who gave the central part of Italy to the Pope, making the Pope the king of the papal states. The reason it did that is that because in Byzantium, which had become Byzantium, Constantinople, the patriarch of the East, which he had separated from the Catholic Church, the Orthodox, was always under the thumb of the emperor, and sometimes made him do things that were not very orthodox. And so he wanted to give the Pope some power. He made him a king, which lasted, up to 1870 when we finally lost the papal state, which we consider now a blessing. Because you see the Pope as the head of state these days. I mean, he has Vatican, the spiritual power is all we need. And so the Franks were settled when his empire, Charlemagne, didn't last very long. His sons were not the same quality as his, and it gradually broke in two parts. But France rather consolidated, is one of the few countries that became cohesive, meaning united. Germany was only united before, in the late 1800s, really. But France became more and more united and under the empire. There was another part of France was Normandy. Normandy, of course, as we know, is very important for our history because that's where St. John Eudes came. Normandy was invaded about the time that Charlemagne started to, at the end, that was the 9th century. During the 9th and the 10th century, the Norsemen, the Vikings, started to gradually come down south. They invaded part of England, they invaded here but they also, mainly, a lot of them came and settled in what is called Normandy. And it's called Normandy because of the Norsemen, the Normans. So we have a real Norman here, within Father Gerard, who is here. My family is mostly originally from there, but it's been a few hundred years, so we lost the accent. So what happened here? We have William is a descendant is a Norseman, is a Viking, and he, when he invaded England, then Normandy was part of the English kingdom up to the 1204, when the famous King John of Robin Hood lost it. So it became integral part of France from then on. What happened is that after the Roman Empire fell and the disorder, gradually it became what we call the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is the time between the end of the Roman Empire to the beginning of what I call the Renaissance. Now, in the Middle Ages, there were all sorts of smaller countries, etc., but it was the domination. The system was very different. I won't go into the details of that because it's not a question of time importance. But again, the church had a great role. The spread of monasticism, and the church was the one who kept the culture going through the monasteries. But the culture, and a bypass, is that we really got it from the Muslim, because we had lost all the Greek philosophers, the artists, etc. had been lost. And gradually, with the contact through the Crusades, through Spain, through Byzantium, to the fight, discovered at that time the Islam had become very highly cultured. They had preserved all of that. And then when that started to be translated, it became a new birth. The Renaissance means rebirth. Renascimento in Italian, it all means that a new birth. It's coming, the culture came to life. A lot of the things that had been dead. And it mainly affected in Italy. The Florence was the center of that, and Milan and all, but Florence in particular, where the study of the Greek philosopher and all that brings a renewal of the great arts and the interest in that, not only the ancient language, but the philosophy. In art, it was wonderful. You just have to see the Vatican, you have to see the painting, and you have some of the examples I give in your book. You have the figures like Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and all those figures, they call them polymarth. They gave the name of a Renaissance man, a person that has multiple knowledge, that is very cultured, and at the time it was possible to know practically everything that was written, but not now today. If we have a computer that can help us and we can go to Waikiki, we can see all that we need. But the Renaissance man came at that time. Although did a great deal for the arts, it didn't have the same effect on the church because it brought also a rebirth of paganism. Although we kept the structure of Christianity and it went on, it affected greatly the moral fiber of the country. The church continues. There was a lot of people. There was a lot of monasteries. But gradually, it became all right to do whatever you wanted. And it started from the head. There's an interesting book, meaning in the church, the papacy. There's an interesting book by Barbara Tuchman, or Tuchman, depending how you pronounce it, called The March of Folly. She wrote many different books, and she's a great storyteller. She died just a few years ago. And in there, she illustrates one of her theories that she found in studying history, that individual groups and even countries will act against their own self-interest. And she gives, for the model of it was the Trojan horse, where the Greeks were at war against Troy, but that they convinced the Trojans their gift, the horse, in which they were hidden, and they do. And people didn't see anything wrong with that, except there was a minority that said, this is ridiculous. These are our enemies. You can't trust the Greeks. And, from the saying, beware of Greek bearing gifts, well, that's where it comes from. And in fact, they were right, but nobody listened to the minority. And then he gives three other examples. The Pope of the Renaissance, the English during the American Revolution, and the American during the Vietnam War. But I won't go through that, but just the Pope. In that story, it shows that the papacy, the popes, worked against the church for 70 years. Now, is that not a proof to you that the Holy Spirit is with us? I don't know. And a lot of people feel terrible about talking about what happened in the Renaissance. Oh, I think it's illustration of how the doors of hell would not prevail, because it was horrible. And what happened is that very wealthy, very powerful Italian noble families took over the papacy, among them the Medicis. The Medicis, who were the Dukes of Florence, who were the patrons of the art, etc., also dominated with other families, the Neri and other things, the papacy, and they then the corruption entered into the church. Incredible for us, and we'll see that later, the corruption that had it. So there were movements, there were people who were trying, there were always the voice of the minority, just like what happened with the Trojan horse. There were reformers all the time that were saying, this is horrible, it's got to change. Three of the names that I mentioned, that was a Dominican in Florence, that Savonarola, who was preaching against Alexander the Sixth, who was the worst, of Borgia. He was really the worst of all, rather not exemplary pope. But he managed, with the Medici, to have this reformer burned at the stake as a heretic. That was one. And I think that these days should be canonized. But then there was, in England, there was Wycliffe, John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe wanted to have the scripture bring to the people, translated in English. He was burned at, I don't know if he was burned at the stake, but he was condemned. Anyways, very, and then there was in the Czech, John van Hus, who was, is still a hero for the Czechs. You go to Prague today and you'll see the square where he was burned at the stake. He wanted communion species. Beware if you ask for things like that, you know. It became, but I'm summarizing. There were other things. Well, basically, they wanted to change the church, and they were all saying it got to be done from the top. Not at all. They had no idea of doing from the top. But so the reform was not taking root, but it was moving. There was really discontent all through. And it was in the German state through that it finally broke. The water broke, if you want. That it happened that here it was Martin Luther in 1517 who published his thesis, his 95 thesis on the door of the Cathedral of Augsburg. And then it opened the time was right. Others had been condemned before him, but he managed, because he got some of the nobilities also were reacting to Rome. It was the exaggeration of the Roman trying to build the Vatican City, to build the Vatican Church, and they were selling indulgences, in other words. Tetzel was going around, and it was very unpopular. But people really believed that they wanted to save their souls, and they were ready to pay, especially the rich paid money. They built monasteries. They got, they could have lived, but it was pushed to the extreme. And Luther at first reacted to that. But then he reacted to everything, and he went to another extreme. He broke he really broke the communion. You have another figure, if you want to read about another one who was also for reform, but didn't break about the same a little later, was St. Thomas More. The life of St. Thomas More. St. Thomas More saw all the corruption and everything else, but he wanted to do it within. And he points out in his history that how much you shouldn't do it with anger. Anger does not produce love. Do it with love, and he was worked within. And although that he was beheaded, he knew what he wrote to Erasmus and everything would survive him, and that in the end he had to maintain communion. But all this history told you that everything was boiling. There was the pot that brought when Luther started, and others with Calvin in France that went to Geneva, others that started. It was beyond control. And then what happened is that kings and dukes and nobility took one side or the other. Sometime for religious reasons, a lot of time for economic reasons. You saw in England, for example, he sort of made the compromise with the English church by seizing all the monastery and selling them. He saw, and they owned practically half of the country. He solved his financial problems, and also he maintained the outside of the church. In other countries, it was not the same. And so the war broke out, and in France, and now we will come to that, to the 17th century France. I'm just going to give you some of the kings here that I'll refer to in my conference. This is the introduction, the setup. So the Reformation breaks down, and that's the 16th century. And just before we come to the 17th century, Luther there. I'll come back to these two later. So in France, there was one of the Medici was queen. There's two of them that came. Mary of Medici was married to the King of France. They had 3 children, 3 boys. They thought they were assured of succession, no problem. And I'll tell you why they were so Catholic in a way, in a while. But there was Henry III. There was 3 child first. I didn't put them all. It's confusing enough the way it is. So they all died young, no children. And so the third one that he was, and Henry the Third realized that he had no choice but to name his distant cousin successor. The distant cousin, who became Henry IV, was a Protestant. And most of the country were Catholic. They were still fighting. They were in the war of religion. They had been massacred. Even when Henry, while he was still Protestant, got his wedding in Paris, there was a big, the massacre of the St. Bartholomew, I think. Saint Bartholomew, they massacred most of the Protestant nobility that came there and others. So that was not to make peace. So Henry, and I'll just mention them, and I'll come back to Henry later. So he was finally assassinated, and he was the king when Saint John Eudes was born, and then his even his father Isaac met him once, and then his son was 9 years old, Louis XIII, and so his mother, another Medici, Catherine, was married Henry, his third wife. And she had hired, so to speak, Cardinal de Richelieu, the famous and very good politician, Cardinal de Richelieu. And he lasted up. St. John Eudes is the one that gave St. John Eudes the papers that signed it to let him start the seminary in Caen and the beginning of the congregation. But he was replaced by Cardinal de Mazarin, or Giulio Manzarini. He was an Italian. The Queen was Italian. He was Italian. He changed his name into French, but he was also a very powerful prime minister until Louis came of majority. When he was 18, and when Mazarin died, he never replaced the prime minister, and he ruled by himself, absolute. The king, absolute power, they called it, and he ran all the time. And one of the things that Louis did, because during this time there was a lot of fighting, the nobility was always trying to take over. And as a kid, he had to run away with his mother because the troops were coming. When he came in power, he said, "I'm put them in their place." He built Versailles. You have a picture, probably many of you have been there, this huge palace outside of Paris. Don't leave it in the capital, because then the mobs can come. Put it far away, and everybody, all the nobility had to come live at the court. And if you didn't have them under his eyes, don't ask for any favor, because if you've been, you have the corridor of the mirrors. They used to walk, and they would line up, and he would walk. And apparently, he had a good memory, at least in the early days, like all of us. And he would come and ask him for a favor, and he would refer to the prime minister, but usually, if the people were not there or he had not seen, he said, "We never see them," which means don't ask. So people learn, so he controlled a lot. So he was the king. And you have all the pictures of these figures there in your book. And that was the introduction to really try to answer the questions that was posed to me. What was the situation of the church? And that comes to the conference that is the middle, that you can read later. That will cover the things that you didn't get of what I said. The main historical event that greatly determined the situation of the church in the 17th century and up to the French Revolution, which was 1789, all that period, nothing much changed in the structure, at least official, of the church during all those periods. The problem, but there was an improvement, was the signing of a concordat. A concordat is a treaty signed by the Vatican with a country. And that was called the Concordat of Bologna. It was a year in 1516, a year before Luther published his thesis. And why that? It's because the King of France, Francis I, we won't go into the reason why, but Francis I invaded northern Italy, trying to get some concession from the Pope. And the Pope was the Pope Leo the 10th. From that same family, yes, there was a relation to the Queen of France and all that. And he was advancing toward the Duchy of Florence and the Papal State. And the only recourse he had was the Roman Emperor, who was not interested, the German Emperor, was not interested in helping him at that time. So he had to make some concessions. And the concession that he made was to sign the Concordat of Bologna. Well, the Concordat of Bologna, the result, made tremendous concession to the King of France. It gave him the authority, the right, to name all the bishops of France. All he had to ask the Pope to approve of them, and they rarely refuse unless sometime, when there was a little tension, they would delay for some time. But eventually, I don't think there was too many that he outright refused. Sometimes you wait till they died, but they still refuse. So, and also the main leaders in the church, like the great abbeys, the abbots. And the thing that was, not only could he name anybody that he wanted, whether they were worthy or not, he also got the revenue. When a bishop died or was moved, there was the see, they call it, was vacant. There was nobody on the throne, so to speak. And so each diocese made their money from rents. They owned land, they owned monasteries, they owned that, and there were revenues that came. Well, the king got the right until the nomination and the approval of the next bishop that he would get most of the revenue for the diocese. And then so sometime he took his good old time naming a bishop. And then for the first year after the bishop was installed, the Pope kept the right to having the revenue of the Vatican to the Vatican, called the anati, was the tax. It was hated by all the bishops, of course. So both of them were benefited from that. And in a sense, when the Reformation broke out, not so far afterwards, because it's a few years, but when it really broke up, it helped keep the King of France on the Catholic side, because not like Henry, he didn't have too much advantage to break out. The Pope approved his candidates. He could name who he wanted. He sort of controlled the church without being separated. They were still united with Rome. And certainly there were other reasons. I'm sure I don't want to say that there was not any other religious reason why they wanted to be Catholic, but at the same time, for a kingdom that was always broke because they were always at war, having a guaranteed income, because people were sort of not only forced to go to church, because there was a lot more control than today. If you didn't go at the time, you were fined, We'll see. So what was the effect of the term of the Concordat on the French church, I asked. The king had always had a lot of influence in naming bishop, but the Pope in the past could appoint other people, and they did appoint friends of his. He appointed, we'll see, I'll mention the Diocese of Coutances in the book that is in your bibliography. And there was, that I remember, one Englishman, there was a few Italian. Of course, they never showed up. They didn't come and sit there. They got other people to do the job, but they got the revenue, they got the income from there. But now, only the king could do that. And so the bishop that succeeded were all French, but they were all they supported the king. Bring us to two of the main problems, if not the main problems, not only of the Church of France, but the church in general at that period. And it was absenteeism, and it was the accumulation of benefice or of tasks. Meaning, is that at that time, half to the majority of the bishops and the pastors did not reside in their parish. The author of the book that you have in your Trent, What Happened at the Council, give two examples. He said, in the Diocese of Grenoble, southern France, on the eve of the Reformation, only half of the pastor resided in their parishes. And in the Diocese of Geneva, in Switzerland, only 20% of the pastors resided in their parishes. Their duties were performed by vicars, priests hired by them for the task. Similar figures prevail in many places for bishops. Jean de Lorraine, uncle of Cardinal de Guise. De Guise was a major noble family in France, and de Guise was finally the cardinal that the King of France sent to the Council of Trent, that we'll see in a moment. So they were higher ups, you know. They, his cousin had three archbishop of three dioceses, three archdioceses, and 9 dioceses. Now, bilocation is a big thing, but 12 is a little too much. I mean, impossible. He never went probably in any of them, or maybe he did, passing through. So that was the accumulation. Later on, and there were many others like that. Richelieu, I didn't do a lot of research because there's exaggeration figure. But he was bishops of many dioceses, abbot of many monasteries just for the revenues. And he built palaces, etc. So that was common practice. That was it. And the practice of distributing dioceses, parishes, and abbeys to the royal favorite was called in Latin ad commendam, which means in trust, in custody. And in the 17th century, the famous, it was, and in French was called la commande. You hear that, you see that sometime in quotes. But it means in custody or in trust. And as said in the previous part, that the pastoral work in the parish were often done by hired priests who had no benefits. Benefits mean you have the benefit of. You get a salary, in other words. They were not salaried. And the same thing as where pastors, like you have two benefits, if you want to use 17th century term. In this parish, you have two priests that are paid by the parish to work. Well, if you didn't have, then you have somebody who are part-time. And then there was a lot more priests because there was some advantage of being a cleric. And some people, by vocation or just because they were looking to get a benefice, would be ordained. And the bishop may ordain somebody if the family sign a contract saying that if they don't have a job, the family will take care of them. So many of them live with their family and look for little jobs here and there to maintain. And they were that type of people that were hired to do the work in the parish. It doesn't mean that there was no services, but the one who had the title got the most of the money. So there was not that much to fix the church, to do other things. And it's the same thing for the bishops, at least, had to be ordained, and so did the priest. And the bishops were either called suffragans, that's the word they use, and they could have been administrator of the diocese, fully delegated by the one who had the title and the revenue to do that, and administer the diocese. And others were auxiliary bishops that went around and did all the confirmation and the ordinations. They were all paid by the one who had the title, and they were just whatever he wanted to give them and kept that. And some had it for a very long time. I'll give you some example. Others were priests that were canons at the cathedral, the chapter of the cathedral they call canons, who were officiate. They were sort of the council of the bishop. Also were supposed to pray for the dead, and they got money that were left to say mass for the dead. They lived on that. Some of them were named to do the visits, because it appears that in most dioceses they did the visit of the parish. They went to check how the church was doing, if the priest was celebrating mass, if the sacrament was administered, if the seminary was taken care of, if the school was working, if there was, and different things like that we'll see. One of them, the successor of St. John Eudes as Superior General, Jean-Jacques Blouet de Camilly, was superior of the seminary of Coutances twice. And so during that period, he was an official visitor. And I'll come back to that. But if I only have 10 minutes, my God, I'm going to talk faster than I did now. So what happened is that if the priest had to be ordained and the bishop, those that they named as abbot were not necessarily priests. They would just give him to a good friend of his who was a layman, and he hired the monk to do the business there. But it brought and kept them on. Some reformed their lives, like the famous Abbé de Rentry, who was Abbé, commendatory abbot of La Trappe in Normandy, and he went back there and reformed the monastery, became a real monk, and it is the origin of the Trappists today. what did the Council of Trent change in the situation of the Church of France and the whole church? Of course, I'll have to summarize briefly, but the church were divided by the Reform, and there was a religious war. The whole countries were lost mostly, and there was the principle that was emitted later on at the Treaty of Augsburg: is as goes the king, goes the religion, so that each king decided what was the religion, and there was no tolerance, except for Henry IV, who did the edict of tolerance for the Protestants in France when he converted to Catholicism. None of that. So they were either persecuted or left the country. And but you think that the Pope would have rushed to change things? They were not interested at all. The Pope and most of the bishops were the product of the system. They were benefiting from it. They did not want to change anything. And especially when it says that the change should start from the head. The prince, the Pope, the Curia, the cardinals, all those people, nobody. So it took 18 years, it took 28 years before the Pope, a Pope, convoked the first session of the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent started in 1545. Luther was in 1517. And he did it because he was coerced by the Emperor Charles V. And he was not very enthusiastic. And a lot of countries didn't send anybody. There was a lot of Germans, a lot of Italians, because the Pope said, you have to go. You're from the papal state, I'm paying your salaries. So they went. And overall, the Council of Trent lasted 18 years with long intervals between the sessions. The French king saw the council as a German-dominated affair and sent nobody. Besides, he didn't think France needed it. He was in control of everything. The church was in good hands, in his hands. The council was only at the last session that he sent the Cardinal of Lorraine with a small delegation, and they were very efficient in making some progress at the council. The council was in many ways a failure. Its goal was to reconcile with the Lutheran. Well, by then it was too late. The divisions were solidified and nothing changed. The only good thing it did, it sort of reconciled the Catholics to themselves. In his epilogue to the Council of Trent, which you can read on page 9, there, he says, in his book on Trent, O'Malley says, in the middle of the 16th century, the Catholic leaders of Europe decided under pressure to play the dangerous game of a council. As the council dragged on for seemingly endless 18 years, they came to reconcile with ever deeper anxiety and frustration what was a treacherous game they were engaged in. The fact that the 25th session of the council, fewer than half were able to publish decrees of substance, suggests that the course was anything but smooth. The Council of Trent lurched from major crisis to major crisis, each of which the stakes were portentous for the future of the West. When it finally concluded on December 4th, 1563, none of the players had reason to be perfectly satisfied with the outcome. The decrees, now, so it is, why come we keep talking? I was surprised when I read that, in a sense, because I had always heard a lot about the Council of Trent, Trent removed the church. It was not Trent. It's what they call the Trent effect. And that's why I say the Holy Spirit had to be there, because the bishops were certainly not full of the Spirit. Some of them were, and those who were there. And the Catholic reformers were not pleased at all. None of the decrees had teeth, They were mostly a recommendation of the formation of seminaries, for example. It was not an obligation, it was a recommendation. All the pious remarks on what should be a good priest and a good bishop were not enforced. They were pious consideration. But what happened is that it created a movement of reform. It created something, and then there were models. One of them was Carlo Borromeo, or better known as St. Charles Borromeo, who himself was a product and a beneficiary of that nepotism, that corruption. He was the nephew of Pope Pius IV. He was named cardinal at 22. He was named in charge of the archbishop. He was Archbishop of Milan. He was named as the equivalent of the Secretary of State of the papal state. But he surprised everybody because he always been a pious kid. They thought, well, make a priest. You're going to be a priest anyways, whether you want it or not, because he was the youngest. But he became a reformer. He became a model bishop. He became an example for all of Europe. He called synod in his diocese. He published the Acts, and they were spread out through all Europe, and they became the model of wanting the one. Once I remember a teacher talking about the Borgia that was so corrupt, and I said, "How come there's a Saint Francis Borgia?" And the teacher said, "Well, even lilies can grow on manure." Consequently, the reform. What was the quality of the clergy during the 17th century? Well, the question is complex. There were some good people or not. The decrees were not published, but they were models. Another bishop that was a Frenchman, but also was Bishop of Geneva, was the one who became Saint Francis de Sales. He was very influential. He was a model bishop also. It became wanting to imitate him. And they were figures, although they didn't change the fact of the command, there was an interest in naming better bishops. And they were influential figures that came. The lay people were very influential. The Friends of St. John Eudes, Jean de Vernières, Gaston de Ranty, and the ladies in Madame Acari. You have that brought in her salon the books of St. Teresa of Avila, Imitation of Christ, of St. John of the Cross. And you had then the Cardinal de Bérulle, that founded the Oratory of France when John Eudes joined, St. Vincent de Paul, St. John Eudes, Monsieur Ollier, all of those founded new congregation with a new spirit of reform. They founded seminaries. They went and preached, tried to renew the spirit of the people, and it changed. In a recent book by Michael Hayden called The Catholicism of Coutances, which you have in your biography, he reviews the Diocese of Coutances for 440 years. And he took, including up to the French Revolution. And in that, he looks at that period, what sort of bishop were there? There were 30 bishops in that period. 5 of them were good bishops. There was one in the 14th century, one in the 15th century. There's only the one in the 16th century, was just at the end, the last 3 years, who became bishop there up to 1620, when the childhood of John Eudes. And then at the end, some of them, they were no saint, the Matignon and the other one that we saw that will work, but they're the one that invited John Eudes to come in and start a seminary and do missions, because he did. And the others, he said, they were 9 were not interested in anything but their own money, their own glory, and the others were in between, not too much. So you see, in spite of that, the church went on. But the movement that happened, that you have all the text that said the 5 best evidently believed. Anyways, I'm going to skip that. Although this period can be seen as lack and the progress of the reform through the visitation report, although very few titular bishops visited the parish, they always send somebody. And they send someone, and we can get a good idea of what happened. There's enough, he says, about Blouet de Camilly, the Eudes. There are enough records of Blouet's visit available to make it possible to obtain an idea of the content and the style of his visitation. The content was standard for the 18th century. His question concerned the parish church, the cemetery, parish finance, the performance of Easter duty, the schoolmaster, the school for girls, the midwives, the legitimate relationships, and the resulting children. Blouet de Camilly was less harsh than Douay's predecessor in dealing with those who failed to make their Easter duty. In most cases, he announced that if private admonition had not produced compliance, there would be public announcement for 3 consecutive Sundays. Only the few who had not performed their duties for many years were threatened with excommunication. So you see, then do your Easter duty, it became a big affair. Up to the French Revolution, until the French Revolution, the practice of command continued. That's the conclusion. I won't say that. The summary. But there was an effort to naming better king. With the tremendous challenge for the Church of France, they had gone through the years of the weak king, all that came. There was a gradual movement. And really, although it was not officially led, the bishops and the king, the royal power and did not head the reform in France, but it happened.
It happened because the people wanted to, because the dedicated laymen, dedicated priests like John Eudes and Ollier and others worked at it, and gradually it transformed. The monastery transformed because they brought, it was the lay people, John Eudes and Birul, who brought the Carmelite to give us a model. And others gradually joined the visitation. They brought the visitation from Vincent. And that it was the spreading movement. It was, but it started first with prayer. They started to gather in those monasteries to pray and to study and to influence the common. So ever dark, you think that our age, there's a lot of people who complain about, oh, the world is going to pieces. The world has always gone to pieces, except that it always, there is resurrection. Thank you.